Welcome to Season 4 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 5, we'll be talking with Daniel Regan about self-care. Daniel Regan is a photographic artist, producer, consultant, and nonprofit director working across the creative health sector. He specializes in exploring complex and difficult emotional experiences, focusing on the transformational impact of arts on mental health, building on his own lived experiences. His photographic work focuses on themes of well-being and brokers dialogue around often taboo topics such as grief, self-injury, suicide, and racism. He also shoots commissions, produces and delivers socially engaged projects, and provides consultancy. He's the founder and current executive director of the Arts and Health Hub, a non-for-profit organization that supports artists and cultural producers that are exploring health, well-being, and what it means to be human. He is represented by Bethlehem Gallery in London. I was wondering, could we start with you just telling me a little bit about your work?
Sure. So I'm a photographic artist, and a lot of my work explores health, and particularly mental health, as somebody with lived experience of mental health difficulties. So I came into photography because of my own lived experience. And lots of my projects are really deeply personal, but I have a sort of participatory arm of my practice working with others, often around kind of themes of health, physical and mental health.
Okay. No, that's brilliant. And so your work is both, you sort of have two different strands of work then, is that correct? So you have sort of your personal practice and then your collaborative practice, is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, I came into photography as a young person because of my own difficulties. So a lot of my relationship to photography is about using it as a way to process life events. And then I think as I've gotten older and, sort of expanded and worked on different projects, I kind of think about how I can use photography to work with others. That might be making images with and of others, but sometimes it's kind of collaborating in sort of the workshop sense of providing skills and techniques for people to take on agency to tell their own stories using photography.
Yeah, that idea of agency is really interesting. And I guess especially when you're working on topics that are quite sensitive or quite difficult for people to maybe, difficult to tackle in any setting. How do you sort of approach that when you're working in a participatory practice with people to approach mental health themes in a way that sort of avoids like re-traumatization or evoking sort of difficult feelings in people?
I suppose it depends how the project comes about. Sometimes they're really sort of long-term personal projects where I happen to have met somebody that has a particular difficulty and the relationship really develops over time, and then that project expands and more people become involved. And other times it's commissions. And I suppose I'm really sort of cautious and conscious about working on projects that are slow, that give participants space to think and rethink about how they take part in a project. So I kind of steer away from things that are very quick, where I'm expected to kind of helicopter in, work with people in this really intense, emotional way, and then sort of disappear. A lot of those long-term projects, I've become friends with participants and we keep in touch. And they have a sense that it's not just me coming in and getting what I need from working with them, but there's a sense of us, making something together, and that they're involved in the process at each step. And that also means that further down the line, if they change their mind and say, actually, I don't want to be, a part of that project, or I don't want you to exhibit my image anymore, that's totally fine. It's about having these kind of really rich, ongoing relationships with people that I work with.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds really, really interesting, because that's a question that people ask me a lot about consent and consent withdrawal, and I think that it really relates to themes of like authorship and ownership and the role of the artist or photographer in facilitating that. And I don't know, could you unpack that a little bit for us, how you approach that in your work?
Yeah, I suppose I don't have a sort of set way of working when it comes to working with other people, because it depends on what the subject matter is, who the participants are, where the work is going. And that's kind of an iterative process. It's a kind of rechecking in with where I'm at, where they're at, and where we are at. I think a good example is I'd worked on a project photographing people with alopecia, which is a hair loss condition. And I worked on that project for 5 years. And it was a very iterative process of, people coming forward to take part in the project. They would email me, but then they might decide that, it's still too soon to be photographed. And there was never any pressure from me. It was that I'm working on this project kind of indefinitely until I say I'm done. And you're welcome to keep reaching out, as you're on your journey of figuring out, how this condition affects you and how you want to take part. And then once people would take part, it was, again, like a very slow process of being with people. At the time, I was photographing in my home studio. So it felt very comfortable. It was my home. I could make people cups of tea and we would talk for a couple of hours beforehand. So it wasn't this kind of rushed, I need to set up my lights and you need to, give me my portrait and then you leave. It was a very slow process of really getting to know people. And also for me to open up and share things in order for them to get to know me a bit. So there was a real sort of developing of a relationship. And once those photographs were made, the aim was that they would be shared in some public way, so an exhibition. But they also had the right to, say, actually, I don't like that image and I don't want to be a part of the project without it really affecting our relationship. After all, it's their body, it's their face, it's their image that was going to be shown in all of these different places. And for some people, they were really on board and they signed off, their consent forms. And we didn't have any other sort of future conversations about how those images were used. But for other people, they were kind of guiding me on, I'm happy for my image to be used in this capacity, but not in this capacity. Or after a couple of years, some people said, I don't feel that way anymore, or I don't look that way anymore. So I don't want that image to be out in the public domain. So could you take it off of your website or make sure that it's not exhibited? And for me, that's about caring about people's images. So for me, it was absolutely no problem to remove that image. And a couple of conversations I had with people who were saying, well, they've signed the consent form. You can do whatever you want with the image. And I was thinking, but why would I do that? I want to treat people the way in which I want to be treated if I am a participant in somebody's project, which is with care. And so the shape of that project has changed over time. And then recently, in the last couple of years, I was approached by Pfizer, who wanted to license one of the photographs from my alopecia project. And it was quite an interesting negotiation because they wanted to license the image and they wanted, rights to use it in any capacity, including a commercial capacity. And firstly, I, before I even went to participants, said, that's not possible. I would never license one of these images to sell a product. And then I went to the participants whose images that they had selected and asked them, what would you feel comfortable with? Because this is, a huge commercial sort of medical giant, and your image could be used in all different capacities. And we had some really rich conversations where the participants got to set the parameters of what they felt comfortable with and what was an absolute no, which was interesting because it was, one of the sort of largest licensing payments I'd ever been offered. But I was still really firm and was saying absolutely no, there's no way that I will allow this in any capacity. So we went through a series of negotiations for about 6 months. And I thought in the end that they would just walk away because I was being quite firm and sort of wouldn't buckle. But it was really interesting to consider, the ways in which people's images can be used once money becomes involved.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, there's so much in what you've shared already. I think that also what you were saying about having these rich conversations with people about what people's sort of firm no's are, that's so different for different people, and I think, unpacking that through these conversations, I'm sure, did you find that with people that different participants had quite different feelings about that? Or did you find that sort of everybody had a similar concern or similar sort of limits?
I think the majority of people had, a consensus that their image could not be used for any commercial gain, which is what I agreed from the beginning, that, we would never use these images to sell a product or enable any kind of lab or any kind of commercial arm that's related to alopecia to use the images. So that was kind of agreed from the beginning. But then I found that even with some exhibitions, participants might say, I don't want to be a part of that exhibition. It really depended where they were on their journey. Some of the people that I photographed were really early on in their alopecia journey. They may have just lost their hair, a few weeks or months ago. And other people, it was, 10 or 20 years. So it really depended on where they were in terms of feeling comfortable with their body. Also, their sort of, in inverted commas, like coming out story, that some people used these photographs to show that actually they do have alopecia and that they don't have any hair, and that they had been wearing wigs and covering up for years. So yeah, it was so dependent on that individual's experience of where they were and what they felt comfortable doing.
I think that's really, really helpful. I also had a question about, your process. You were describing it as a very slow process. And I guess I was wondering, logistically, in terms of, do you have funding to support these projects? And how does that work with funders? Because a lot of times funding is time-bound, right? What does that look like logistically?
So for that particular project, it was completely self-funded and self-initiated to begin with. And then as the project went along, there were kind of pockets of funding that I was accessing for producing work or producing an exhibition or an advertising budget for the exhibition. But definitely wasn't, a commissioned project from the beginning. It opened up pots of funding along the way. For some of those like the funded projects, it is really tough because, as you say, they are time bound. And I think it puts a lot of pressure on both myself as the artist producing it, but also the people that are involved in the project to try and build this relationship. And it makes me think about another project called I Want to Live, which was in collaboration with Maytree, which is a suicide respite house in North London. And I'd been a volunteer there. So it's a non-clinical space where people that are in suicidal crisis can stay for 4 nights, 5 days. And I'd been a volunteer befriender there for a year before I approached the director and asked if I could do a photography project. And I went away and got some funding from the National Lottery Community Fund. But that project, it was only a year for me to produce it. And I was photographing other volunteers and interviewing other volunteers about why they volunteer at this particular, very niche organization. And it was because a lot of those volunteers, including myself, had some kind of lived experience relating to suicide, whether that was their own experiences or they'd been bereaved through a friend or family that had died. But it was quite difficult to, create these spaces that felt really comfortable for people to share their stories, knowing that I'm on a deadline to produce the work, and then I need a chunk of time to produce a book and to produce the exhibition. I suppose I still try and think about the ways in which I work with people on the day. So I don't say to people that, we have an hour together. I block out a whole morning or a whole afternoon. And make it so that we're having those conversations and cups of tea and really getting to know each other. And there's no pressure for us to photograph on that day. I'm always happy to return another day if people feel that actually I'm still not ready. So I guess just really prioritizing that slow process wherever you can, even if that means you're up against it, working to a deadline. But I won't work on projects that have that sort of in-depth emotional capacity if the deadline is, in a month or two. It's just not possible. And I think it's often to the detriment of myself and others to work in that way.
You've spoken a lot about taking that time and having cups of tea and sharing something of yourself. So it's a very vulnerable process, I guess. It reminds me a little bit of something that in another episode, Justin Carey was saying about how for a long time, I don't want to butcher this, but he said something about how for a long time he was photographing people, but he realized that he wasn't being as vulnerable in return. Like he was asking people to be vulnerable with him, but he also needed to be vulnerable and honest in that experience. And I don't know, I guess that adds sort of a massive challenge, I guess, sometimes for people. And it can be quite scary to be vulnerable. How do you protect yourself, I guess, in that?
It's a very interesting question, and one that I've been sort of grappling with over the last decade. I think for a lot of my projects, I kind of come to them because of my own experiences. That's what piques my interest. So, working with Matri on the project around suicide, I came to that because of my own mental health difficulties. That's why I volunteered at that particular organisation, as opposed to, at a puppy playhouse or something. For me, I'm more interested in being in places and using my kind of skills and knowledge that are relevant. But it does mean that I'm also, opening up a Pandora's box sometimes. So whilst working on that project, I interviewed and photographed 19 other people. And the conversations that we had were so rich and so moving. But I was really conscious that I left a lot of those interviews feeling incredibly heavy. And sometimes I would, be on my journey home and burst into tears. And that's not to say that, something bad was happening, but that I also was not perhaps in the sort of project design. I wasn't conscious of thinking about the impact of myself. And so us being together and being vulnerable was a really beautiful moment. And the photographs, were a part of that process. But I really needed to think about how I protect myself and how I care for myself. If I was going to kind of go back and do that project again, I think the thing that I would have put in my sort of funding application was to have some mental health support for me to also think about the impact that this is having on me as the artist producing the work. But yeah, I guess I go into these projects because I'm really passionate about them and I've got some kind of background and connection to them. And going forward, I'm always thinking about how will I manage the impact that this work will have on me emotionally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's really valuable for people to hear because I do think that that's a piece of the puzzle that we sometimes forget about. I think, there's an increasing level of conversation about, duty of care to contributors or participants in these projects. But I do think we sometimes forget about ourselves. We do have a duty of care to ourselves as well, especially when we're working on these really potentially triggering issues. So you've talked a lot about your participatory practice. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your personal practice?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, I came into photography because of my mental health problems as a young person. And so my sort of practice, my personal practice is intrinsically bound up with this way of working that is about process. When things happen to us, my instinct is to pick up my camera and start to work through what's happening. So all the way back from, early teens to, just recently producing a project all around racism, I'm always trying to figure out through photography the things that are happening to me and what it means to be me and live through these experiences. So some of my previous projects are around my own hospitalization as a sort of late teens person at university, through to commissions around really personal works around my experiences with self-injury, which was commissioned for Science Gallery London. And then more recently, a project around racial trauma, which was for a mental health trust in North London. So my projects always look very different. I don't have this sort of consistent style, but the thread that weaves through all of the work, the very personal work, is that it's in response to some kind of lived experience. In the last couple of years, I've been making lots of work around grief and loss in response to my mother's sudden death. So it's all very sort of rich personal work that I guess starts with, something that has happened to me. And then it's sort of further down the line that I think about how that work goes out into the world and how that sort of iteration of the work goes out into the world, because there's definitely parts of these projects that are just for me and don't make it out into the public because they're just very personal.
Yeah. How do you navigate that? Yeah. What can be seen and what can't be seen, and how do you make those judgments? And also, I guess that really informs how you exhibit, again, participatory work and how you approach those conversations.
I think a theme in a lot of my, really personal works, there's this presence of oversharing and undersharing, and I play with that a lot in my work. some of my projects, I'm using my mental health medical records, but I use them in a way which you can't really get to the details. So in some of the projects, like in Fragmentary, I'm using my medical records, but I've redacted certain parts of texts. So you get a sense of a part of the story, of this sort of mental health story, but you literally can't see some of the words. And then there's other ways that I play with sort of bringing viewers in, but pushing them away. And sometimes that might be layering up physically in a sort of an installation of these records, layering them up on top of each other, but they're printed back to front and upside down, so that the sort of audience get quite frustrated that you really want to find out about this person's mental health journey, but you can't quite get the full picture. And I guess I do that deliberately because I want to feel safe in sharing parts of my work that, you know, are so personal, to put your medical records out there in the public. And so I kind of use these different tools or methods to give you everything, but also give you nothing at the same time. And that's something for me that is about protecting myself in my work. I want to share my work, but I also want to feel secure, and I want to have an element of self-preservation there. So for me, it's been about developing these kind of strategies of how do I share things in a way that feels safe for me. And that even, it just makes me think about how I write about my work, the sort of statements that go alongside some of my projects. So when I start writing those statements, they're always like a short essay, and then they get chopped and chopped and chopped. And we do that anyway in the way that we write about our work, so that it's consistent and clear. But for me, it's about chopping out some of the, you know, really personal, emotional content, because I sort of think, do I really want that bit out in the world? Because once it's out there, it's out there. And I suppose there's things that have happened in the past where it's made me reconsider, you know, how much I want to share with people. If I get a sort of internal feeling that gives me a bit of the jitters, and I think, you know, this doesn't make me feel safe, then I know that it's absolutely not meant to go out in the world. And as you said, working in that sort of participatory way with other people, I always encourage people, you know, to think about, how do you want to describe this work, and how much do you want to give to the world, and what is just for you? Because we do live in an age now where once things are out there, they're out there, and it's very hard to get them removed. And that's always my concern.
I think that's so interesting. I really love what you've said there. And it makes me think a lot about, like, I think I'm a chronic oversharer. But I don't know. It's like, I think with the history of photography, there's been a lot of sort of exploitation of the stories of others. And recently, you know, there's a lot of turning the lens on ourselves. But then, yeah, to what extent are we exploiting ourselves now and exploiting our own stories for the sake of, I don't know, exhibition of our work or something? I don't know. I think there's something really interesting in that. Does that make sense?
It just made me think about how we're all really pushed to, you know, document and share images constantly on social media. And some of the work that I've done in the past with young people is really encouraging them to slow down. You know, if you're going to make a series of images, can you make images that are really meaningful? And then do you even need to share those images for them to be meaningful? A couple of years ago, I was working on this project at Bethlehem Psychiatric Hospital, and I was working on an adolescent ward for young people under section. And I wasn't aware before I started working on the project, but the young people there, they were only allowed to use their phones for 2 hours a week, which I was so shocked by, because I thought, as a teenager these days, how is it fair that you can only use your phone for 2 hours a week? You know, what impact will that have on you feeling isolated from your peers that are, you know, not in a hospital setting? And so the idea behind this project, that was for an exhibition at the Bethlehem Gallery, was for us to go in with digital cameras, so not smartphones, and to support the young people to tell their own stories using photography. And it was really interesting to talk with them about what image making means, this kind of constant need and desire to make images and share those images in order to be seen or kind of validated. And it was just fascinating to kind of work with them to think about, what are the images that we're making about your experience being in hospital, and what will the image mean, or how will the meaning of the image change if you want to share it, or if there is a pressure to share it. And it was, you know, interesting to chat about making images just for ourselves, images that mean something but don't need to be seen. It's the act of making that is the whole purpose there, not the witnessing.
I think that is really interesting. And I think it's really interesting as well to think about, the pressures, of course, like you said, the pressures on everybody, that we sort of have to, if it's not on Instagram, did it happen sort of culture. But especially as, practitioners or artists, that you have to have outputs. And I don't know, it makes you think really maybe more critically about what kind of outputs, but also, do we need outputs? What do you think? Do you think we need outputs? Because that's actually, I think it relates to something that I've sort of struggled with sometimes with my own practice, is a worry that I'm being navel gazing, and that if it doesn't have an output that relates to others or that other people can benefit from in some way, then maybe it's not worth doing. I don't know. Can you speak to that?
It makes me think about how I have, different aspects of my practice for different things. So that very personal practice, I'm not particularly interested in outputs. It's about the process for me, because it's an act of me processing something that has happened. And I just happen to do that through photography. That's my way that I process. Some people draw, some people want to talk about things. For me, it's I need to pick up my camera and make work. But I'm not really considering where the work goes. Sometimes it is years and years later that a kind of an opportunity comes up, and I think, this is not how the work was intended to be, but it might, be the sort of next chapter of that work. And then there's the more work, which is people paying me to produce work. And of course, you're bound by their expectations of an output. So I guess I need to consider, how am I making this? What are the concerns or the ethics around making this kind of work? Or also the ethics of, caring for the participants and also the audience members if it's an exhibition. So they're two very different ways of working. And sometimes I've got bodies of work that, are unseen and they don't need to be seen. The only person that needs to see them is me, because they're made just for me. And other times I am making work because it's a commission and I know that it has to be seen in some way.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that care for the audience?
Yeah, I guess it's quite complex, and I don't necessarily have answers, but I do have lots of questions particularly around how we make work on the subject of mental health, and then where that is shown and how that's shown. I guess an example of something that was quite complicated that came up was that commission that I mentioned for Science Gallery London. So the gallery opened in 2018 and is part of King's College London. And their remit is to look at the intersection of arts and science and the particular audience demographic of 16 to 25-year-olds. And so their first exhibition, which was called Hooked, I was commissioned as one of the sort of first commissioned artists. And that exhibition was looking at addiction. And my proposal was to look at non-suicidal self-injury in relation to my own experiences. And we went through quite a rigorous sort of proposal process, because part of the board were not quite sure whether non-suicidal self-injury comes under addictive behaviour. And as a person with lived experience, I was saying, well, yes, it does, because I have experienced that myself. And so through making that body of work, which is called Threshold, it's a series of images of my own body with lights projected onto them, representing different emotional states that lead up to and endure and the sort of aftermath of self-injury. And it's quite sort of, I think it's quite sort of fantastical and beautiful. It has nothing to do with kind of the physicality of scarring on the body. It's these really beautiful lights. And there's also a short film that I made of lights projected onto the body whilst I'm breathing. But when it came to actually showing the work, I wrote a statement for the project, and the gallery said that I couldn't show that statement, which I hadn't experienced before. And the gallery said, that they were going to write their own statement that represented the work. And I was a bit confused by it. And so I sort of challenged, what's wrong with what I've written about the work? And because of the subject matter, they were concerned about any kind of interpretation that may be even remotely positive about, that kind of behavior of self-injury. And of course, I understood that they have a duty of care to people that come to the gallery that look at the work. But I felt there was a real complexity in almost censoring my lived experience and the way that I describe what it's like to go through that process of self-injury. So there was a sort of conflict there of me feeling like, I've been commissioned to make really personal work about my lived experience, but how I describe my lived experience is now sort of not enough for you, or you want to use words that are not my own, it's not a huge criticism of the gallery, because I understand their obligations and their concerns. But it does say something about the complexity of making work about lived experience and how that is then shared and sort of censored or protected in some way.
That's a really interesting example. Absolutely. Like, I think there is just so much complexity, isn't there? Because I totally see what you're saying about the duty of care to the viewer and not wanting to be promoting or triggering self-harm behaviors in the viewer. But yeah, I can understand that also, though, could feel quite confronting or just very negative for you as well as the maker and the person with lived experience and the person who's been so vulnerable in this process. That's a really interesting and really, really complex.
Yeah, I think I found it quite disempowering is perhaps the expression. But I'm not quite sure what the solution is. It's the same kind of conversation around trigger warnings that I'm not a person that really believes in trigger warnings. I understand trigger warnings for particular content, but I feel like sometimes we are putting trigger warnings on everything because we're so scared of confronting any kind of distress. And sometimes, things are difficult to look at or difficult to engage with, but that's a part of being human. And I think we have this sort of, this cultural fear of anything that's difficult now. And also that if you are the person that has experienced the thing that is difficult, and then you slap this sort of trigger warning on it, sometimes we've already been through a lot of distress, as an individual, and then it feels like your distress is then being, censored, or your story is being censored when, in some cases, if it already feels like that, it already feels like your story is being censored. And this is a chance to tell it. And then it's interesting, I've had this conversation around trigger warnings quite a lot recently. And then there was this meta-analysis that came out around trigger warnings. I found it really fascinating that, this data shows that that trigger warnings are not useful, that actually a trigger warning can cause more distress because of the anticipation of the content that you're about to engage with, and that they're often not being used as a way to avoid content, but there's something that, when content has a trigger warning, it almost like draws people into that content, which I find really fascinating. But it's such a personal decision. For me, I do understand why they're there, but I also don't want to keep censoring, real life lived experiences. It's important for us to see and witness and feel witnessed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really interesting about the trigger warnings. Maybe you can share the link with us to look at that some more, because I'd be really curious to read more about that. But yeah, I mean, I can totally understand what you're saying about feeling the risk of censorship in that, especially because it can take someone a really long time to talk about these things themselves. Like, there's so much self-censorship in a lot of these things. I think that we wait so long to talk about these things in a lot of instances. And then when we finally do, to experience that level of barrier, I'm sure it can be quite re-traumatizing potentially as well.
Yeah, if you have been silenced, or you have silenced yourself and then you are being silenced again, sometimes I just think, that there's other ways in which we can advise people around the content that they may engage with. I feel that sometimes this huge, all caps trigger warning, and then these quite, the words themselves are the things that cause people anxiety. If you put all caps trigger warning, sexual assault, I find that quite confronting. It makes me nervous already. But if I read a description about the work and it mentions that there is, it relates to sexual assault, then I want to make an informed choice about whether I should engage with this. So it's not even just the concept of a trigger warning. I think it's the way in which we share what work is about that gives people some, responsibility to themselves about whether they engage with it or not.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess all of these conversations are probably conversations that you have quite a lot at the Arts Health Hub.
Yeah, I think when people are making work about their lived experience, artists are kind of thinking about, I'm making this work for myself first, but of course I want to share it because we all want to be seen. We make this work, we want to be heard, we want to be seen in some way. That's what artists do. They want to share things. But then there are the considerations of, how do I share this work safely? Who do I share it with? Where do I share it? And those are kind of questions or decisions that really impact, I guess, the value of the work, how people engage with it. This kind of work that both I do and lots of the artists that we support through the Arts and Health Hub, it's not traditional artwork. It's not traditional photography. It's photography that is quite different and unusual. And maybe the places in which it's shared are not those kinds of white-walled galleries, but they're spaces that relate to healthcare environments or community environments, community centres, or supported by charities that also support other people affected by these conditions. So I think we talk quite a lot around, what feels right to share and in which way do we share that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that idea of sort of moving work out of the gallery and into maybe more public spaces can be really interesting and can promote, well, obviously a much wider viewership in a lot of cases and access to people who might not otherwise feel comfortable entering into a gallery space. So that's definitely a really interesting conversation. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your work with Arts and Health Hub?
Yeah, so I started my own organisation called the Arts and Health Hub after I finished my master's. So I did a photography master's. And during my studies, I was specifically looking at the benefits of photography for people living with mental health difficulties, sort of rooted in my own lived experience. So a lot of the work that I was doing was very much very personal works around my own sort of processing of my mental health difficulties. And on my course, there were various people that I got along with, but our work in terms of like the themes didn't really overlap. And then once I finished my course, I felt quite isolated, acknowledging that I'm not a commercial photographer, I'm not a commercial artist, and I have no interest in doing that kind of work. Part of the reason for doing my master's was really figuring out, how do I continue to make this kind of work and make a living? And when I finished the course, I felt quite sort of lonely and isolated. And I asked a health centre where I'd been running some projects if I could have a space once a month for artists that are exploring health in their practice in some way to get together and share active ideas and projects and challenges. And so those artist peer groups were really the beginning of the organisation, looking at how artists can support one another instead of competing, which is so much about my experience in the sort of commercial photography world that was so competitive, which I back away from. I'm not a competitive person. I wanted to create a space which was about supporting one another. It's about knowledge sharing. It's about being generous with each other. And so those peer groups are still running. And I think we've had about 100 of them now. And we're going into our 8th year in September. But the organisation is also growing in lots of other ways, but always looking at how we can support artists that are making work about health. So a lot of those artists are making work about their own lived experience or working in participatory ways with people living with physical or health difficulties. And one of my key priorities is really thinking about artist care. And that comes from, my own experiences of how do I care for myself in the work that I do. And I want other artists to have that kind of knowledge or access to resources around how they care for themselves when they're making work about their own lived experiences or when they're working with other people that have various difficulties. How are we caring for them in the work so that it's not purely transactional But there's a real ecosystem of care in the way that we work, which is slow and generous and compassionate.
Oh, it sounds brilliant. Well, is there anything else that I should have asked you but didn't?
I guess there's things in there about like how we learn these ways of working, because I think a lot of the things I've learnt or developed have been through trial and error. There was very little from, both of my photography degrees about how to care for yourself and care for others in this kind of work. I suppose in my formal studies were very much about technique and technical aspects, very little in terms of participatory practice and the ethics of participatory practice. And so a lot of this has been, through trial and error, like that May Tree project, sort of reflecting back and thinking, I wish that I had factored in some kind of clinical support. But I guess that's all part of the learning process of just thinking about what, I know what I don't need, so what do I need? So for me going forwards, when I'm working on projects now that where I have access to funding and I know that the content is really difficult, I'm always factoring in having some kind of clinical supervision where I'm essentially having work therapy with a therapist or an art therapist to process some of the difficulties that come up. But it's interesting that a lot of this is kind of missed in the sort of formal education around photography.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that's also the benefit of these like peer support groups, like the one that you've started at the Arts and Health Hub, is tapping into sort of that knowledge that other people have gained through trial and error, so we don't have to make the same mistakes or encounter the same challenges.
Absolutely. I think through the peer groups, one of the main points of the groups is for artists to share things that are active. So it's not a finished presentation space where we all, pat you on the back and tell you how amazing you are. The artists are all amazing, but I encourage them to think about sharing the difficulties and the challenges of where they're at, because that's where the learning happens. And that's where the learning happens for the artist that is sharing, but also for other people in the room who may be at a similar juncture and can't quite figure out how to navigate, the ethics of a project or the complexities of this particular way of working. And that through that kind of peer-to-peer group, I feel that's how, we kind of move forward. We learn about the things, the ways in which we work that are caring, that are professional, that are considered. It's really hard to do this work on your own. So having a network of people around you that is supportive and not competitive. I mean, for me, it's been immensely helpful to have others to be able to check in with and say, I'm working in this way, but I'm stuck. Can you help me? And not just have to try and do it by myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of speaks to like something that I'm really passionate about, which is vulnerability, right? Because that obviously showing things in progress and being very open about where we're stuck and where we're experiencing challenges and what we need help with, asking for help, like that requires a lot of vulnerability. And I think it also sets a really great precedent or example for others that like everybody gets stuck, everybody hits these different points and has challenges and runs into ethical dilemmas that they don't know how to navigate. And so, yeah, I think that's a really, really great point. I like to ask everybody, what does photography ethics mean to you?
Oh, for me, it's about considering the impact that our images have on ourselves and on others. It's not about going through the world just making because I want something, I need something. This is all about, me. When we work with others in particular, it's about considering how other people that engage in our work feel. There's a really great film that came out recently called Subject, about the subjects of documentaries that have been made. And it was so fascinating to hear from the subjects of documentaries, not the directors, but the subjects, about the impact on what it's like to engage in somebody else's project. So for me, when I think about ethics, I think about how we care for the people that we work with and photograph. And we really think about what kind of experience do we want them to have.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Nilupa Yasmin on unconscious bias. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to make the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.